I was up here, I just finished a series on Habakkuk, and it had been like 6 weeks since I saw a warm body in here. So this is really good for me. I really appreciate you being here, and I've been looking forward to it. I got a little jealous of Jesse. He got all the comeback stuff, and so now it's my turn. I've never met a single person who wanted to live a bad life. Never have. We all want to live a blessed life. We all have our perspective, though, on what that looks like. What is the good life? Is it a healthy life? Is it a wealthy life? Is it a quiet, peaceful life? Is it a poverty life, a life of a vow of poverty? Is it successful? What does it look like? And I would ask you that question. What do you think is the good life? And think carefully before you answer, because how you answer that question is what you will be committed to. Because what you think the good life is what you're going to give your time, your energy, and your resources to becoming. Doesn't it make sense that we go to the God who created life to find out what a good life really is? And so I'm doing this brand new series starting today called The Good Life, and it's on the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus, as we read earlier, began by saying this is what a blessed life looks like, and he carries on from there. Now, as I was studying the Beatitudes and beyond about preparing for this series, I had no idea that I would not make it out of chapter 5. There's just too much there. There are 16 themes alone in chapter 5. 8 of them are the Beatitudes, and then the other 8 are the ones that we're going to cover in this series. So somewhere down the line, we're going to have a Good Life Part 2, maybe a Good Life Part 3, because there's so much here. And Jesus uses this wonderful sermon, the greatest sermon he ever taught, to show us what that looks like. I want to put a quote on the screen from one of the greatest preachers of the 20th century. He was a Scottish preacher by the name of James Stewart. In fact, his name was James Stewart Stewart. His middle name was Stewart, and it was spelled different. Isn't that funny? But I've listened to a little bit of bits and pieces of his sermons online because I love his Scottish brogue, and he was really a go-getter. But this is what he said. He was a brilliant preacher and theologian. He said the greatest threat to Christianity is Christians trying to sneak into heaven incognito without ever sharing their faith. In other words, the greatest threat to Christianity is not humanism, it's not secularism, it's not even atheism. The greatest threat to Christianity are Christians who try to sneak into heaven without ever getting involved in what God is doing, without ever becoming what God created them to be, and without ever getting in on one of the greatest missions that God ever had for us. And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is trying to remedy that problem, the problem of Christians trying to get into heaven without ever getting involved in what God is doing. And think about the crowd that he's speaking to, the one that I tried to get you to imagine to be a part of a few moments ago. These are very common, ordinary people. He's not speaking to the United Nations. He's not speaking to Congress or Parliament. He's not even speaking to a small gathering at City Hall. He's speaking to some very regular, normal people, people who had no say in what they could do because they were occupied. They could not determine their own destiny. They had no choice as to what they would become. It was kind of whatever happened, happened, and there's nothing they could do about it. And it's these kind of people that Jesus talked to and said, you know what? I know you're under a foreign government and you think that you can't live a good life, but I'm here to tell you you can. And as insignificant and small as you think you are, I have a plan and purpose for you that involves living a good life. And so Jesus goes about teaching this, and here's what we're going to discover today. He's going to teach us that the good life is all about making a difference in the world. It's about making a difference in the world. And in the context of everything that we have experienced the last couple of weeks especially, but even the last few months, this should be right in the center of our wheelhouse as Christ followers, that we need to make a difference in the world or things will not be different. And so through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus starts his teaching by saying, look, this is what I created you to do, to make a difference. So I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to begin reading a few verses together, and then we're going to break them out and see what exactly Jesus was trying to tell us. Matthew chapter 5, we're going to start reading in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Well, let's stop here and just pray and ask God to open our hearts to what he has to say to us. Okay? Father, as we begin this series and this sermon on one of the greatest teaching moments in your life and one of the greatest teaching moments in history, would you prepare our hearts to hear you speak? Father, open our hearts to be receptive and responsive to what you want us to do and be. Convict us of where we have been unfaithful and untrue. And just guide us from this point forward to be someone, man or woman, who makes a difference in the world. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I call this sermon today, Shakes and Splashes. Shakes and splashes. Because Jesus is going to talk about salt and light. And you've heard our worship time kind of gather on those themes. And so hopefully you're getting prepared for what he's going to say about this. Let's see what Jesus says it takes to live a good life. So if you're taking notes, here's the first thing. The good life, first of all, calls us to shake salt on a decaying world. To shake salt on a decaying world. You don't have to look around you very far to know that our world is decaying morally. So in the first part of verse 13, Jesus says, you, and he's talking to common everyday people like you and me, you are the salt of the earth. Now, why does Jesus refer to us as salt? Well, think about this. Salt is a miracle. As you know, it's composed of sodium and chloride. Now, if you were to take some hydrochloric acid and pour it on your hand, within a matter of seconds, your hand would be burning, totally burning, and it would really, really be painful. If you were to drink hydrochloric acid, in just a few moments, you would die a very painful death. But if you take sodium and add it to that hydrochloric acid, all of a sudden you've got salt, one of the best substances in the world, right? Something that you use all the time. Some of you use a little too much of it, but you use it all the time. A very common, useful substance. Now, you need to understand how valuable salt was in the days of Jesus. In Jesus' day, they didn't have refrigeration. So salt was a very valuable commodity for everyone. In fact, it was traded pretty much ounce for ounce with gold. Did you realize that a Roman soldier was paid in salt? In fact, the word we get the word salary from comes from the word salt. And when a Roman soldier didn't do what he was supposed to do, he wouldn't get all of his salt. And that's where we get the phrase, and maybe you've heard this, that guy's not worth his salt. He or she's not worth their salt. It's because they haven't done the work that they were supposed to do. Well, our world is decaying, it is rotting, and it's our job, Jesus says, to be a preservative, to preserve the holiness of God, to preserve the goodness of Jesus as much as we can. As bad as things are right now, imagine a world that had no church. Imagine a world that had no Christians. Imagine a world that had no Bible. As bad as it is now, imagine what it would be like without those that Jesus calls the salt of the earth. How bad would things be? Well, we need to be salt. But Jesus says there's a danger. He goes on to say, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? Now, that's kind of confusing, isn't it? Because any chemistry teacher knows that it's impossible, in a way, for salt to become unsalty, because sodium chloride is one of the most stable substances on earth. It doesn't change. It never loses its character. But there is a truth to what Jesus is saying, because you see, much of the salt that was used in Palestine came from the Dead Sea, which is more than 1.5 miles below sea level. And the Sea of Galilee, which flows into the River of Jordan, finally ends up in the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea has an inlet but no outlet. And so it stays there. It has no place to go. And once the water gets there, the sun evaporates it, and it kind of leaves behind a chunky white powder, which is made up of a combination of salt as well as some other minerals. Now, that powder contains enough salt to season meat or to flavor soup, and that's why people used to gather their salt from the Dead Sea, but it's also mixed with minerals. So it's not necessarily pure sodium chloride. And when a little dampness gets in the air, that salt can be dissolved and basically dissipates, which leaves behind this residue, and that's why Jesus says the salt can lose its seasoning. Now, what does that have to do with you and me? Well, the worst thing that a Christian could lose is not his wealth, is not his health, is not his testimony. That's what a Christian cannot lose. Because if the Christian loses his testimony, he loses his seasoning. What happens is when Jesus goes on to say it is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot, he means it's literally good for nothing. See, the one thing that can contaminate the salt of our life is the dirt of worldliness, the dirt of our culture. I mean, you look around and see what's happening. When we conform to our culture, instead of transforming our culture, we lose our seasoning. And that's why Jesus said it's not good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, let me go on to tell you what that means, because being trampled underfoot, you would have to have been again in Jesus' day to understand what he was saying. Whenever salt was brought out from the Dead Sea that was contaminated with other minerals, and it would make it taste flat or even repulsive, basically worthless, you couldn't throw it on a garden or a field because it would kill whatever was planted there. So what they had to do was they would throw it on the road. And eventually, when it was trampled on or driven on by carts or horses or whatever, it would eventually go down deeper and deeper into the soil. And people would just walk over it. And so Jesus is saying salt that's lost its seasoning is not good for anything except to be trampled on, to be walked on. And let me just say this. The church is being walked on by the world today. We are being walked all over. There's no respect for the church in the world anymore, is there? There's no respect for Christ followers anymore. Because we are just too much like the world. We use the same foul language. See the same movies, ignore the same Bible. And the fact is, the average person in culture looks at the person who calls himself a Christ follower and sees no difference. You know, the majority of religion in America is still Christianity, and yet we're so dominated today by the values of secular humanism. And in Korea, there are 35 million Buddhists and only 2 million Christians. But in Korea, the major influence is Christianity. Why is that? Because Korean Christians understand what it means to be salt and light. They know what it means to be seasoning in their culture. So Jesus said, you and me are the salt of the earth. And salt is worthless if it never comes in contact with food. If it just sits in the shaker, does no one any good. It has to come in contact with food, and we have to come in contact with the world to season it. So we got to get the salt out of the shaker and onto the earth where it can do some good. The good life, Jesus says, calls us to shake salt on a decaying world. Secondly, Jesus says, the good life calls us to shine light on a dark world. Shine light on a dark world. In verse 14, Jesus goes on to say, you are the light of the world. Now, what's the difference between salt and light? Well, salt relates to our character. Light relates to our conduct. Salt is what we are. Light is what we do. And we know what light does, right? Light dispels darkness, and it attracts. If you go into a dark room, wherever the light is, the eyes will go to it. If I were to turn all the lights out in here, all you would see are those exit signs lit up, and your eyes would immediately go to where the light is. Now, it ought to be obvious, but the reason Jesus commands that we shine as light in the world is because our world is in total darkness. Several times in the Bible, we're commanded to be light. The Apostle Paul takes this theme, and he talks about it a lot. Let me just put some scriptures up on the screen to let you see. 2 Corinthians 4:6, Paul said, for God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, made his light to shine in our hearts, to give us light, the light of the knowledge of God's glory, displayed in the face of Christ. And then in Philippians 2:15, he says, so that you may become blameless and pure, the children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. And in Ephesians 5:8, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. So over and over again, we're told to be light. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, wait a minute. Jesus said he was the light of the world. How can I be the light? Well, the answer is pretty simple. And those of you who remember your science know that the sun, our sun, shines. Our moon does not. Right? You do know this, right? I hope you do. That the moon simply reflects the light of the sun. When you look at the moon at night, you see light, but it's not coming from the moon. It's reflecting from the sun. And so if you look at it this way, Jesus is the sun and we're the moon. We're simply reflectors of his light. Jesus goes on to say, a town built on a hill cannot be hidden. And what he's saying is, you know, if you have a chance to go to Israel, you'll understand what Jesus meant, because back in the Bible days, they didn't have bulldozers like we had, so cities were kind of built one layer over another. When one city was conquered and was crumbled, and they would just come in and build something on top of it. You go over there today, and that's what happened to the city of Jericho. Remember the walls came down? And they came down, they stayed down. Well, they built on top of it. And they became hills, or what they call over there, tells. And so this is what Jesus is having in mind. He's saying a town built on a hill or on a tell can't be hidden because it is raised up. So, he goes on to say in verse 15, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. Jesus says it's ridiculous to light a light so that you can see and then hide it under a bowl. Now, in Bible days, of course, they had these lamps with oil. And what they would do is they would take that lamp and they would set it up in the highest place in the house. Maybe they had a shelf, or maybe they had some kind of a high chair or something where they would set it up in the highest point of the house so that it could give light to the rest of the house. And Jesus says, look, you don't light that thing and then cover it up with a bowl. He says, that's ridiculous. But what he's trying to tell you and me is, you know what? It's exactly what we're doing in our world. We're hiding our light. We're hiding our light in a dark world. See, Jesus didn't say you can be salt or you should be salt. He said you are salt and light. And we're supposed to be shaking the salt on a decaying world and shining the light in a dark world. That's how you have a good life. And then one final thing Jesus says here that says what the good life is, and that's that the good life calls us to share the truth to a dying world. And Jesus concludes this idea by saying this: in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, that raises a question. How do you know if you're being salt and light? Well, here's the test. When people see your good deeds and they glorify your Father in heaven. You know, I'm convinced that the two greatest days in the life of an individual who is a Christian is, first of all, the day when they're born again. And second, the day when they come to understand why they are born again. When you begin to live your life in such a way that people are attracted to Jesus Christ, when they see your good deeds, it points them to the Father, and the salt is there and the light is there, you will know that you're making a difference. Some of you may remember the days of the Susan B. Anthony dollar. Remember those? You know how long they were in circulation? 3 years. You know why? Because they looked like a quarter. They did. People were very confused because here was something that was a dollar, but a dollar is really 4 quarters. So how can that? And so it only took 3 years for it to go out of circulation because it just looked like another piece of change. Now, Christ followers, I think sometimes we're guilty of the same thing. We're guilty of looking like all the other coins. We're guilty of looking just like the world. And people are confused. And we can't be salt. And we can't be light. We can't be what God called us to do. Live your life in such a way that you reflect Jesus. And it brings glory to God and causes other people to want to glorify God. The good life, Jesus says, is about you understanding that I created you to make a difference in the world. If you want to live a good life, you need to shake the salt. You need to splash the light. You need to be what I've called you to be and make a difference in the world. A couple of years ago on Halloween, most of the time my kids come over and they go trick-or-treating, but what Diane and I like to do is we like to set up a couple of chairs in the driveway rather than have them come to the door. We sit out in the driveway, and as they come by, you know, we come and we meet them, and we give them candy and everything. And so a couple of years ago, y'all might remember this, it was a very cold Halloween. Remember, the weather was really cold, unusually cold. And so Diane and I were out in chairs with blankets, and I had just this little fake fireplace that I have in my camper. It's about that size. It puts off a little bit of heat, so we're trying to stay warm under this thing while the kids are all trick-or-treating. And I don't remember which all kids were there. I remember that Evie was there, and Felix and Heather and Marcos were there, and they took the kids trick-or-treating. And I remember when they got through, we had ordered pizza or had pizza, and they went inside to warm the pizza up, get it ready. And Diana went in with them, and it was just me and Evie sitting out. She wanted to stay and help me pass out candy. So we did. And so we sat there for a little while and finally kind of got slow. And so I looked down and I saw Evie's huge bag of candy. And I said, Evie, how are you going to get all that candy into your tiny little body? And she thought for a minute, and she has an answer for everything. She said, don't worry, Pops. I'm bigger on the inside than I am on the outside. Guess what, Christian? You're bigger on the inside because of the Christ who lives in you than you are on the outside. And God has placed within you the light of the world. You need to be the salt and light to a world that's decaying and dark and dying. Is that what you're doing? Or are you just looking like everyone else? Is there no salt? Is there no light? Is there just sneaking into heaven without ever getting in on what God has for you? What is the good life? Jesus says it starts with being salt and light. And it'll be other things too. We'll talk about that next week.